I'm going to tell you something that's going to sound completely insane. I was there. I watched it happen with my own two eyes, standing maybe 30 feet away in a corridor that smelled like ozone and old blood, and recycled air that the station's filtration system had been failing to clean properly for about 6 weeks. I had a plasma rifle slung across my back that I wasn't going to use. I had a half-eaten protein bar in my jacket pocket that I'd been saving for later, because the mess hall on Erebus 7 was running on emergency rations, and everything tasted like cardboard anyway. I had 17 missed compings from my commanding officer that I was absolutely going to answer as soon as this situation stopped being the most extraordinary thing I had ever witnessed in my 19 months of deep space deployment. I watched a human man, a civilian, not even military, not even security cleared for half the areas he'd clearly walked through to get there, walk into the holding corridor of the most fortified containment block in the entire Galactic Concord's jurisdiction. And I watched him look at her, and I watched him not run. That's the part nobody believes. That's the part that, even now, sitting here with this recording device humming on the table between us, makes me feel something I can't quite name in my chest. Something between pride and awe, and a kind of second-hand embarrassment on behalf of every soldier and diplomat and Concord official who had stood in that same corridor before him and turned around. Because they all turned around. Every single one of them. Except him. Let me back up. Let me give you the context, because if I just tell you what he did without explaining what she was, what she is, you won't understand why the whole station stopped breathing when it happened. Her designation in the Concord's official files is Subject Kael'Vora, Classification, Apex Vampire Origin, Shattered Moon System Vethari Cluster. That's the bureaucratic version. That's the version some administrator in a climate-controlled office on a core world typed into a database without ever having been within 500 light-years of her. On Erebus 7, we called her other things. The senior technicians called her the anomaly. The security rotation called her the problem. The Krethdar soldiers, 4-meter tall, chromium-plated, with nervous systems designed to process physical threat signals 3 times faster than any organic being in the known galaxy, called her something in their language that their translation implants rendered as the thing that should not be awake. I'll tell you what I called her, quietly, when I was doing night rotation, and I had to walk past the outer observation window of her containment cell. I called her impossible, because that's what she looked like. The containment block itself, Block 7, Sub-Level 4, the section of Erebus 7 that nobody got assigned to if they had good standing with the brass, was built for her specifically. Not for vampires in general, for her. The Concord spent the equivalent of 11 years of planetary terraforming budget constructing a containment environment calibrated to her specific physiology, her specific threat profile, and the very specific problem that nobody in the GCC's 37-species coalition had been able to solve. She kept getting out. Not out of the station. Let me be precise about that because the distinction matters. She didn't escape into open space. She didn't breach the hull. She got out of every containment apparatus they put her in, every cage, every field, every restraint technology 17 different species of engineers had designed. And she walked through the station doing whatever she pleased until she felt like going back. Which she always did. Go back, I mean. That was the part that confused everyone the most. She would get out. She would walk through corridors where armed soldiers pressed themselves against the walls and stopped breathing. She would visit the botanical observation deck, the only place on the station with actual growing things, a cluster of earth plants and Velusian ferns and one very stubborn Arcturian moss that nobody had managed to kill, and she would sit there for hours. Then she'd go back to Block 7. The first 3 times, Command thought it was a trap, a psychological game. They sent extraction teams to bring her back by force, and she let them think they were doing it. She'd let the field nets close around her and walk back to her cell as if she'd always meant to return there, and the teams would file their reports with slightly shaking hands, and she would be contained again until she wasn't. The 4th time, she went directly to the senior commander's office. Commander Vreth Kalos of the Krethdar, a being who had survived 6 planetary conflicts, 3 conquered tribunal processes, and a diplomatic engagement with the Void Speakers of the Outer Reach, which most beings did not come back from with their psyches intact. She sat down across from him. She looked at him for a very long moment, and she said, in perfectly accented galactic standard, which she should not have been able to speak, because her species predated the language by approximately 9,000 years. Your filtration system on sublevel 2 is causing atmospheric discomfort to the juvenile Marrow-Sin technicians in Lab 3. I suggest repair within 48 hours. Then she left. The filtration system was repaired in 36 hours. After that, Vreth-Kalos stopped sending extraction teams and started leaving the botanical deck access corridor unguarded on a rotating schedule. Unofficially. The report still said, contained. Everyone on the station understood what was actually happening, and nobody talked about it in any log that might be reviewed by anyone on a core world who hadn't stood in that corridor. This is the being. This is who she was in the months before it happened. The physical reality of her was something that recordings didn't capture properly. I've seen the official documentation footage. It's crisp, high resolution, the best tech the Conquered has, and it still manages to make her look like something you could process. Something your brain can file away and categorize and be finished with. She wasn't like that in person. In person, she was tall. Not towering, not alien monstrous tall, just tall in a way that felt deliberate, like height was something she chose to wield. Her skin was the color of old starlight, that very particular shade between silver and white that you only see at the edge of a dying system's illumination zone, where light has traveled so far it started to forget what warmth felt like. Her eyes, and this is the part that shows up in every single account from every species who encountered her, from beings whose visual processing works completely differently from human eyes, her eyes were red. Not red like blood, not dramatic theatrical vampire red. Red like the deepest point of a stellar core. Red like something that had been burning since before your civilization learned to count. A color that didn't feel like a color, it felt like a decision. A choice that the universe had made at some fundamental level and not bothered to explain. Her hair was dark. That's the mundane version. The accurate version is that her hair moved in a way that suggested it was aware of its environment, tracking air currents with a subtle intelligence that your eyes caught and your brain refused to accept. And it was dark the way deep space is dark, not black, not the absence of color, but the presence of something too vast for color to contain. She wore what she'd been wearing when they found her, a long coat of material that no xenobiologist on Erebus 7 had successfully identified, structured, and collared, with geometric markings along the sleeves that the station's historical analysis systems had flagged as possibly pre-conquered, possibly pre-civilization, possibly pre-everything. She was ancient. You could feel it. Standing anywhere near her containment block, you could feel it in your hindbrain, in the part of your nervous system that existed before your species developed language or tools, or the concept of being afraid of something specific. That older, truer fear, the one that says this thing has seen things that would end you. You felt it without thinking about it. Your body knew before your mind caught up. Every species felt it. Krethdar soldiers who processed fear differently, who didn't have the same biological fear cascade that humans did, they felt it. Marrow-Sin technicians, whose sensory apparatus didn't include anything resembling a human amygdala, they felt it. The Vesh Collective members on the station, who shared a distributed consciousness across 11 bodies. All 11 bodies felt it at the same time, and afterward they requested reassignment to a different section of the station and were granted it without discussion. She was feared by everyone, without exception, without negotiation. Until Rael. His full name was Rael Mosencraft. He was 31 years old. He was from a settlement on the outer rim called Calder Station, which was one of those human outposts that nobody on the core worlds thought much about, functional, self-sufficient, completely without prestige, the kind of place that produced people who were comfortable being comfortable with things that weren't comfortable. He was medium height, brown hair that needed cutting. A face that would have been unremarkable if not for something in the expression. Not confidence exactly, more like a complete absence of the social anxiety that most people wore at least partially at all times. He was a xenoanthropologist, civilian academic, technically on Erebus 7, under a research permit that the Conquered had issued 18 months prior, as part of a political gesture toward human academic institutions. The kind of permit that was issued freely because nobody expected civilian researchers to actually come out to stations this far from the core. And certainly nobody expected them to request access to Block 7. He'd put in the access request 11 months ago. It had been denied 11 times. I know this because I personally carried 3 of the denial notices to the administrative office on Sublevel 1. I remember thinking, the second time, this person clearly doesn't understand what's in Block 7. The third time, I thought this person is either very brave or very stupid. By the 6th time, I'd started to wonder something different, something I couldn't articulate properly. He came to the station in the 4th month of his permit period, did his research in the public archives, filed careful and meticulous reports on conquered xenodiplomacy history, and every 17 days, like clockwork, he filed another access request for Block 7. Every 17 days. I looked up the Vethari calendar system once, in the station's xenocultural database. 17 days in standard time corresponds to one complete cycle of the binary moons of the Vethari cluster home system. I don't know if Rael knew that. I think he did. The 12th request came in 3 days before the incident. This one was different from the others in one specific way. It included a research submission, a formal academic proposal with 16 appendices that the administrative AI flagged for human review because it contained language that the system's analysis protocols categorized as outside standard parameter assessment. I read it, not because it was my job, it wasn't, but because the administrator on duty was busy and handed me the tablet and asked me to see if it was worth flagging for Commander Vreth Kalos. It was about 40 pages, dense, carefully written, full of citations from 12 different cultural archives spanning species from 6 different galactic quadrants. The core argument, stripped of all the academic language, was this: that the Vethari vampire species had a specific cultural framework around what they called the bid, a formal acknowledgement of recognized capacity between beings, and that the Conquered's containment of the subject designated Kael'Vora was, from her cultural framework, not imprisonment but insult, and that her voluntary returns to containment were not compliance but waiting. Waiting for what Rael's proposal argued with careful citations and 17 different supporting sources was the bid. A formal recognition from an equal, or from someone willing to present themselves as an equal, that her existence and her nature were being acknowledged rather than feared. Nobody had made the bid. In 8 months on Erebus 7, across hundreds of interactions with beings from 37 species, not one of them had made the bid. Not because they didn't know about it. Rael had found references to it in the Conquered's own archives. It was documented. Multiple xenoanthropologists over the past several decades had noted the cultural framework of the Vethari in passing, in footnotes, in supplementary materials of studies focused on other things. Nobody had acted on it. Because to make the bid, you had to stand in front of her. And nobody, standing in front of her, could make themselves stay. I handed the tablet back to the administrator and said it was worth flagging for the commander. She flagged it. The commander read it in 40 minutes. I know because I was in the outer office when he called the administrator back. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something in his native language that the translation implant rendered as "let the human try." It was not officially an access approval, but the door to Block 7's outer observation corridor was left unsealed at 600 station time the following morning. And Rael Mosen Craft, xenoanthropologist, civilian, Outer Rim settlement kid with a research permit and 11 denied access requests, walked through it. I followed him, not because I was ordered to, because I needed to see. Block 7's outer observation corridor was a long space, roughly trapezoidal, with one wall of reinforced transparent material that looked into the inner containment area. The material wasn't standard. It was a composite that the Conquered's engineers had developed specifically for this application, 6 inches thick, capable of withstanding forces that would have compromised standard-grade containment fields without blinking. The environmental controls in the corridor itself were set to maintain a temperature about 4 degrees cooler than the rest of the station. Another one of those unofficial accommodations that had developed organically over 8 months. She was sitting when we came in, sitting the way she always sat, not in the chair the Concord had provided, which had never been used, but on the elevated platform in the center of the containment area, cross-legged, her coat spread around her, completely still in a way that was different from the stillness of sleeping or resting. She was still the way a star is still. All the violence contained, all the energy running deep, the surface giving you nothing. Her eyes were open. She looked at us. Most beings who looked at her looked away within about 2 seconds. It was involuntary. The hindbrain just made the decision without consulting the rest of you. Rael looked back. He stood at the transparent wall and he looked at her, and he didn't look away. I stood about 30 feet behind him. I pressed my back against the opposite wall, which was not exactly a professional posture, but represented my honest assessment of the appropriate distance from what I was about to witness. I kept my hand nowhere near my plasma rifle because nothing about this situation called for a plasma rifle, and also because I was fairly certain that if things went wrong, a plasma rifle would not be among the relevant variables. Something shifted in the containment area. Not movement exactly, more like a change in atmospheric quality, like the air itself was paying attention. She tilted her head, just slightly. The gesture was curious was the word that came to mind, but it was the wrong word, too small, too ordinary. She tilted her head the way a civilization tilts its head when it encounters a question it hadn't considered in a few thousand years. Rael reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. I did not move, I did not breathe. He pulled out a small object and held it up to the transparent wall. It was a piece of Vethari astronomical charting material. Old. Physically old, not reproduced real material from the Vethari cluster, the kind of thing that should have been in a museum vault under environmental controls, not in a xenoanthropologist's jacket pocket on a frontier station. It was a fragment, maybe 8 centimeters square, covered in notation that I couldn't read, but that matched the markings on her coat. He held it up for exactly long enough for her to see it. Then he set it down on the ledge below the transparent wall, and he stepped back. And he spoke. He spoke in galactic standard, but with careful, deliberate pauses between phrases that, I only understood this later, reading his research notes, were the approximate cadence of formal Vethari address. It was not fluent. He was not pretending to speak her language. He was showing that he had learned enough to know how the language breathed. He said, I know what you are, not what the Concord's files say you are, not the threat assessment or the containment classification, what you actually are. Pause. I know that you have been waiting. Pause. I am making the bid. Silence. The kind of silence that has texture. The kind that Erebus 7, with its constant mechanical hum and atmospheric cycling and distant crew movement, had never once produced in any of the 8 months I'd served on it. She looked at him for a very long time. Long enough that I stopped being aware of my own breathing, because my body had decided breathing was a secondary concern. Then she stood up. She didn't move quickly. She didn't make a show of it. She just stood, and the act of her standing felt like a reclassification of the space she occupied, like the room was adjusting itself to acknowledge what it contained. She walked to the transparent wall. She stood on her side of it, 2 feet away from the material, and she looked at him at close range for the first time. And he did not step back. His breathing changed. I could see it from across the corridor, his shoulders the way they rose slightly, the way he held very carefully still against whatever his nervous system was telling him to do. He was afraid. He was absolutely, genuinely, completely afraid. He did not step back. She looked at him for a long, long moment. And then, in galactic standard, with an accent that was not quite any dialect anyone on the station had heard, something older and more careful, words shaped by a mouth that had been forming language since before most species in the Concord had developed the cognitive architecture for speech, she said. What is your name? Rael exhaled. Just once, a short, controlled breath that he pulled back under control almost immediately. Rael, he said, Rael Craft. She looked at him. Rael Craft, she repeated, and the way she said it, each syllable given exact weight, tasted and considered, like something being entered into a very old record that didn't get erased, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up in a way that I am not ashamed to admit. Why are you not afraid? She asked. And he said, and I am quoting this precisely because I have replayed it in my head at least 400 times since that morning. I am afraid. I'm very afraid. But you've been here for 8 months and you've had 17 opportunities to hurt someone and you haven't. And I studied you for 11 months before I came here, and I think you deserve to talk to someone who isn't running. Silence again. She was looking at him with something in those stellar core red eyes that I did not have the vocabulary for yet. I have more vocabulary for it now. The word the Vethari Cultural Archives use in the closest standard translation is recognition, not surprise, not what humans might call being impressed, something older and quieter, the acknowledgement of something long expected finally arriving. The bid, she said, requires a counteroffer. I know, Rael said. You know what the counteroffer is. Yes. And you accept the terms? He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. I counted. Yes, he said. I did not know at that moment what the terms were. I found out later, reading his research notes in the report he filed the following week. The terms of the Vethari bid, the formal acknowledgement between a vampire of the old blood and a being presenting themselves as an equal, were simple. They were total. Once made, the bid could not be unmade. The one who made it became, in Vethari cultural law, irrevocably recognized, marked in a tradition that predated every institution in the galactic conquered by approximately 9,000 years as someone who had stood before the ancient blood and had not run. This was not a small thing. This was the kind of not small thing that has consequences across the rest of your life. Rael knew that. He said yes anyway. What happened next was not dramatic in the way you might expect. There was no flash of light, no ancient ritual, nothing that looked impressive to observers. She reached through the containment wall. Through it, not breaking it, not phasing through it in any way my understanding of materials science could account for. She simply reached through 6 inches of the most advanced composite material the Conquered had developed, the way you might reach through water, and she placed her hand flat against his chest for exactly 2 seconds. Then she withdrew. The wall was undamaged. My instruments showed nothing, no breach, no energy signature, no record of anything happening. Just the reading going briefly unusual and then settling. Rael stood very still. Then he took a breath, a long one, and his shoulders came down from where they'd been held for the past 20 minutes, and he looked, I am going to say this knowing how it sounds, he looked lighter. Like something that had been weighing on him without his full awareness had been lifted, which makes no physical sense, which is also exactly the accurate description. She looked at him from her side of the wall. You are the first, she said, in this epoch. I know, he said. You are not afraid now, she said. I'm still afraid, he said. That's not the point. She was quiet. No, she said finally, and something moved in her expression, something that the face of an ancient being allows very carefully and very rarely, something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to it in the way that a planetary system is adjacent to the space around it. It is not the point. I stood in that corridor for another 10 minutes after Rael eventually stepped back from the wall, gathered himself, and walked past me toward the exit. He nodded at me on his way out, just a nod, like we were 2 colleagues passing in an ordinary hallway on an ordinary day. I stood there for another 10 minutes after he left, looking at her. She had gone back to her platform. She was sitting again, the same position, the coat spread around her, the red eyes forward. But something was different. It took me the full 10 minutes to figure out what it was. She wasn't waiting anymore. That quality I'd mentioned, that coiled, ancient, volcanic patience that radiated from her at all times, the sense of eventual that made the air in the corridor feel pressurized. It was still there, but it had changed its shape. It was no longer the patience of something waiting for recognition. It was something else. Something that I looked up later in Rael's research notes. The Vethari word for it was Karath. The closest standard translation was attended, not belonging to, not claimed, not in the romantic human story sense of those words, something more precise and more ancient. The state of a being who has been seen, fully, correctly, without flinching, by another, and who now exists in a different relationship with the world because of it. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about what it costs to be something that everyone around you fears, not because you've hurt them, but because you're simply too much Too old, too strange, too powerful, too real in a way that ordinary existence doesn't know how to hold. I thought about waiting 8 months, but also much longer than that in ways I couldn't fully calculate for one person to stay. One person out of every being on the station. One person out of the hundreds who had filed, passed her containment block, and felt that hindbrain signal and turned around. One human who was afraid and stayed anyway, and said, "I know what you are, and you deserve to talk to someone who isn't running." Commander Vreth Kalos called me into his office the following morning. He asked me to give a verbal account of what I had witnessed. I did. He listened to all of it, which took about 40 minutes without interrupting once, which was unusual for him. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. "The bid," he said eventually, in his slightly formal standard. "We have documentation of this cultural framework in our archives." "Yes, sir." 11 different xenoanthropologists referenced it in archived research material over the past 30 years. "Yes, sir." "And none of them?" "No, sir." He was quiet again. "The Krethdar do not have a concept in our culture precisely equivalent to what the human researcher did today," he said. "We have courage, we have tactical suppression of fear response, we have calculated risk engagement." He paused. "What the human did was not any of those things." "No, sir," I said. "I don't think it was." "What was it?" I thought about it. I thought about Rael's face at the transparent wall, the way his shoulders had held that careful stillness, the way he'd looked at her and she'd looked at him, and the thing that had passed between them that my instruments hadn't recorded and that I had no technical language for. "I think," I said slowly, "it was respect, not the kind you give because someone can hurt you. The kind you give because they deserve it." Vreth Kalos looked at me. He said something in his native language that the implant didn't render cleanly. It came through as something approximate, something like we should have known the humans would be the ones to manage this. I didn't ask him to repeat it. Things changed after that morning. Not dramatically, not in any way that would show up in an official report with clear causation, but things changed. She stopped getting out of containment. Not because the containment had improved, because she stopped having reason to. Rael came to the outer corridor every day and they talked through the transparent wall and she talked. In a way that nobody on the station had heard her talk before, which was at length, with continuity, in the manner of someone who had a great deal to say and had been waiting for an audience capable of receiving it. He took notes. Careful, meticulous, dense notes in the academic shorthand of someone who was aware they were recording something that didn't exist anywhere else. The history she told him, about the Vethari cluster, about the species that had lived there before the Concord's expansions reached that region, about things that had happened in epochs that the Concord's own historical records barely acknowledged, would eventually become a research corpus that fundamentally revised several significant assumptions about pre-Concord galactic history. But that came later. What I observed, in the days immediately following the bid, was smaller and more specific than historical revision. I observed that she asked him questions. Not tests, not the sort of probing challenges you might expect from an ancient apex predator assessing a potential threat. Real questions. Questions that had the quality of genuine curiosity, about his settlement, about what humans made of the vast and chaotic galaxy they'd stumbled into, about what he had thought when he'd first found references to her culture in a dusty archive file and decided to spend 11 months preparing to stand in front of her. I observed that he answered them honestly, even the uncomfortable ones. Even the one she asked, around the 3rd week, about whether his people were afraid of her before they met her. He said yes, honestly and without apology, and explained that it was a complicated kind of fear because it was mixed with the particular human impulse toward things that are overwhelming and incomprehensible, which was not pure flight but something more tangled. Something like wanting to understand, even when understanding felt dangerous. I observed that she listened. Really listened, in the way that ancient beings listen when they've decided something is worth listening to, which is completely and with full attention, and with the quality of someone filing away information that they intend to keep. Around the 5th week, she stopped sitting on her platform during their conversations. She sat on the floor, close to the transparent wall, which put her at roughly Rael's eye level. I noticed this the first time it happened, I don't think Rail noticed immediately, but I saw it and I understood it and I filed it away. I'm going to tell you one more thing that happened in this period, before this account transitions into the formal record. It was the 37th day after the bid. I was doing my standard rotation past Block 7's outer access corridor, which I had quietly arranged to include in my route on a permanent basis in the weeks following the incident, because something in me needed to keep monitoring this situation that was not my assignment. Rail was there at the transparent wall. She was on her side. They weren't talking. They were just present in the same space, which is something that happens between people who have been talking for weeks. That comfortable silence that means communication has moved past the point where words are required for every moment. And I heard her say something, very quietly, not to him exactly, more like to herself or to the air, in a way that wasn't intended to carry, but did because Erebus 7's block corridors had strange acoustic properties. She said in that careful, ancient accented standard, "In 9,000 years, only one." And Rail, who apparently had very good hearing, or was just paying very close attention, said quietly back, "I'm sorry it took that long." She was silent. "You will not apologize for your species' limitations," she said eventually. Not harshly, just factually. "No," he agreed, "I won't, but I can still be sorry it took that long." Another silence. "Yes," she said, "I believe you are." I walked past the end of the corridor and continued my rotation, and did not record that exchange in my official log. Some things are not for official logs. Some things are just for knowing. The galaxy did not stop being afraid of her. That's important to say. That's not what the bid changed. It didn't change what she was or what she was capable of or the deep, accurate signal that every nervous system within proximity of her broadcast on the level beneath conscious thought. The fear was real. The fear was appropriate. You should be afraid of something 9,000 years old that can reach through 6 inches of the most advanced composite material in the Concord as if it's not there. But one human man was afraid of her and stayed anyway, and offered her the one thing nobody had offered her in this epoch. Recognition, the courtesy of being seen correctly, the respect of someone who had done the work to understand what she was before standing in front of her, and deciding she was worth standing in front of. That's what the bid was. Not a peace treaty, not a negotiation, not a tactical solution to a containment problem. Just one person deciding that fear was not sufficient reason to turn around. When I tell this story, and I do tell it more often now because people ask, because word has gotten around the way words get around on frontier stations, I get asked the same question every time. What happened to him? The answer is complicated and ongoing and not mine to tell in full. Rail Mosen Craft filed his research with the Galactic Academic Consortium and received, eventually, the kind of recognition that academic institutions offer to work that fundamentally disrupts their existing frameworks, which is to say, slowly and reluctantly and with considerable institutional friction, but genuinely. The Concord's relationship with the subject-designated Kael'Vora underwent significant reclassification over the following months. This is documented in the public record. What's not in the public record is the detail I keep returning to, the one that stays with me when I'm doing late rotation and the station is quiet and I have time to think. On the 91st day after the bid, exactly 1 Vethari calendar cycle after Rail first walked into Block 7's observation corridor, the environmental monitoring systems across Erebus 7 recorded a brief anomaly in Block 7. No breach. No threat signal. The systems registered a change in the containment environment that lasted approximately 40 seconds and then resolved without incident. The timestamp matches the exact moment, in the station log, when the outer access corridor's observation records show Rail Mosen Craft placing his hand flat against the transparent wall from his side. The records don't show what happened on her side of the wall. But I was there. I was there doing my rotation, and I looked through the glass. And I saw what 9,000 years of solitude looked like when it finally allowed itself to be met. I'm Corporal Dean Vasquez, 14th Human Expeditionary Unit, Erebus 7 Station Assignment. This is my witness account, submitted as part of the open record per GCC Order 779 Alpha. I've told you what I saw. Make of it what you can. I know what I make of it. I think about one human man, afraid, staying anyway. And I think that maybe that's always been the most dangerous thing we ever were. Not our technology, not our adaptability, not the famous human stubbornness in crisis, scenarios that the conquered keeps writing reports about. Just that. The willingness to stand in front of something ancient and vast and terrifying and say, I see you. I'm staying. I think she'd been waiting 9,000 years for exactly that. I think she'd been right to wait.